Good. Just quick reminder, please stay behind the line. Don't approach the band. We'll make sure you get all the opportunities in the world for a good thing.
Are you going to miss us? Are you going to miss us?
Yeah, once they get started, they all come back. Ready?
Yes, he is. You want 30 minutes to film. I didn't realize how far it was. And I'm pregnant, so. Oh my God, I'm too I packed her a sandwich in case, she got hungry. You're not excited? Oh, it's empty. So it's all good. Oh. Oh, I gotta go.
If you're innocent, look over here and tell everybody. Just tell everybody.
Do you have anything to say, Mr. Murdaugh?
Justice for Stephen Smith!
Thanks for letting me cram in here.
Clearing up your cram hole, floor.
Crime. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 50 minutes before reaching the unanimous verdict that Alec Murdaugh is guilty in the shooting deaths of his wife Maggie and son Paul. The pair was found dead on their family property on June 7th of 2021, and now, nearly 2 years later, the defendant faces up to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And with us down in Walterboro, South Carolina, is Law and Crime's Anjanette Levy. Anjanette, welcome. A juror spoke out this morning saying it only took 45 minutes to an hour for most jurors to be convinced of Murdaugh's guilt. 9 were already convinced of his guilt. 2 thought he was not guilty, and then 1 person was not sure. Does this all surprise you, Anjanette?
No, not at all, Michelle. And good morning to you from Walterboro, South Carolina. It's not surprising to me. We thought there were some jurors who had some pause yesterday when we were looking at them. Of course, it's difficult to read, but it's not surprising to me at all that some of them may have had some doubts or thought that he was innocent. Jim Griffin gave, I thought, made some persuasive points in his closing argument, and we knew that they would be really talking to not only all of the jurors, but they would really be kind of focusing in on maybe 1, 2, 3 jurors. One of those jurors we think that they would have been speaking to was the one who was dismissed, the one who wanted her dozen eggs before she left. So I'm not surprised at all. I can tell you, when I went into the courtroom last night, when we were getting word that there was likely a verdict, I talked to someone upstairs who told me they went in and asked the jurors if they wanted some dinner, if they wanted the judge or the court staff to order dinner for them. And they said, no, give us 10 minutes. We're almost there. So they were pretty ready to do what they were going to do. And it sounds like, too, just the things that we've been hearing, the foreperson may have been a pretty strong-willed person. I noticed yesterday she showed up wearing a pantsuit. So I took that as a sign. Also, a juror sitting next to her was kind of wearing a blazer and some slacks, and a woman up top had a skirt and some suede high boots on. So it seemed to me that they believed that yesterday was going to be an important day.
And tell us who you were able to speak with last night after finding out the verdict.
Pardon me. Yes. I spoke with a number of people who've been attending the trial and also spoke to Justin Bamberg. He is a state representative here in South Carolina, but he's also an attorney who represents many of the financial crime victims of Alec Murdaugh. And he said he was basically pleased and relieved by this verdict. You know, they didn't know what was going to happen. They thought that the state had made the case, but this is a case that got a lot of attention. And there were some parts of the case and parts of the investigation that you could see as, putting some doubt in your mind. So he's looking, to move forward. He will be here today. He's looking to move forward with his clients who are financial victims of Alec Murdaugh, one of them being the gentleman who's a quadriplegic. You probably heard them refer to him when questioning and cross-examining Alec Murdaugh. So a lot of people will be here today, not quite as crowded as yesterday. I'm going to turn really quickly. Maybe just a couple of people over there in line, not the big camp out line overnight like we're used to seeing. So it's really a solemn day. I mean, this is a tragedy. There were people celebrating last night and clapping as members of the prosecution team walked into the courthouse this morning. But two people, were murdered and slaughtered. A family has been destroyed. Buster Murdaugh has lost not only his mother and his brother, but also his father. So this is a solemn day. It's a sad day. It's sad to see somebody who had such a great life, do so many things to bring it all crashing down. He destroyed his life, and he destroyed the lives of his wife and his son and his family. I mean, this family is going to be shattered.
That's a great point there, Anjanette. And we are expected to see Alec Murdaugh in an orange jumpsuit today coming into court. Buster will be seeing that. I mean, you talk about victims. Who do you expect to speak out during victim impact statements this morning?
Well, we're not 100% sure on who might speak. We were kind of wondering if Marion Proctor, Maggie Murdaugh's sister, who testified in this trial, we were wondering if she might come back to speak. We don't know if Buster is going to speak. Keep in mind, he's been here every day supporting his father, but he's a crime victim. So he may be speaking. We don't know. Alec Murdaugh, is he going to speak? He was already on the stand. What stops him from getting up there and saying something today? I don't know, but certainly we will hear from the attorneys on both sides and the judge. So it'll be interesting to see what the judge has to say about the case.
Anjanette, when we look back at this trial now, I mean, when we think about Alec Murdaugh last week taking the stand, in retrospect, did that really do him in? Should he have really not done that?
It may not have mattered either way, but it may have, because obviously the jurors didn't believe him. And for as good of a liar as Alec Murdaugh is supposed to be, there were a lot of key points in his testimony about what happened that evening down at the kennels. What was the last thing he said to Maggie before getting on the golf cart and going back up to the house, according to his story, when he left them there alive, where he didn't have answers. And you would think he would have replayed that night in your head a million times if you came home, you left your family, came home, and then found them murdered in such a horrific way. So there were a lot of things, a lot of questions for somebody who's supposed to be such a skilled liar. There were a lot of things he couldn't answer to, and I thought that was odd.
And yeah, that's exactly right, because Craig Moyer, who was one of the jurors who spoke out on Good Morning America today, he said Alec Murdaugh is a good liar, but he wasn't good enough. And when asked about those tears and his emotions, he bluntly said, those weren't tears. I didn't see any tears. But what he said we saw was snot. I mean, I think the jury just was not convinced at all that this man had any remorse what he did to his family. And Anjanette, you have been in that courtroom. You have gotten the pulse of that courtroom for the past 6 weeks. Do you agree?
I obviously, maybe some of those initial jurors who were unsure or voted not guilty, maybe they believed him, but in the end they didn't. But no, I don't think, obviously they didn't believe him. If they believed him, we'd have a hung jury or a not guilty verdict. So they didn't believe him. I can't attest to whether or not there were tears or not. We saw tears maybe early on in the trial during some of the crime scene photos that were being displayed and things like that. But they were sitting there next to him. They had the bird's eye view. They can speak better as to whether there were legitimate, genuine tears. Obviously, we did see the stuff coming out of his nose. I think we all saw that and we're kind of like, yikes. So I don't know how he makes that happen.
Anjanette, quickly just describe the vibe last night. I mean, I think a lot of us were not surprised by the verdict, but we were surprised by the speed of the verdict and just how fast things moved, 2 hours, 50 minutes. And then now the jurors coming out and said, we really made a decision in about 45 minutes to an hour. What was the vibe like there last night?
I think it was anticipation, but I think when they came back after 2 hours and 50 minutes, I think everybody knew what the likely verdict was going to be. I've covered cases where a jury came back quickly and it was a not guilty, but I've also covered cases where they came back quickly and it was guilty. And I thought from, I guess the middle to the end of this case, I thought that it would never be a not guilty. I thought it was going to be guilty or a hung jury. So an acquittal, I thought, was aspirational. That was a very lofty goal for the defense to want to get an acquittal, because I think there were pieces of evidence that were clearly not in favor of Alec Murdaugh's story. The kennel video, in my opinion, being one of the biggest pieces of evidence. But also, there were some things in the investigation that I believed were mistakes. So no investigation is perfect. And I'm not surprised at all by this. There was a little bit, it was like a quiet frenzy. I know that sounds odd, but when we realized something was going on, people kind of ran toward the courthouse. It wasn't a stampede, but everybody was kind of quiet but rushing to get in place. So a lot of spectators hanging out outside, hoping to get in to watch the verdict be announced. So it was interesting, but it was a strange calm. I'll tell you that.
Well, the jury has decided. And of course, as you mentioned, that kennel video was really one of the top pieces of evidence that people said, this is it. This is why he did it. And I saw your tweet last night saying, hey, Paul Murdaugh was in his own way a little detective. He was the one to really solve this crime and leave that behind. So definitely, Paul Murdaugh helped himself there in some way. Anjanette, I know you have to get going because you have to go into that courtroom because we do have a sentence hearing happening around 9:30. Thank you so much for the update. Great job as always. And I'm sure we will hear from you throughout the rest of the day. Thank you so much, Anjanette. And we here at Law and Crime are going to take a quick break, but so much more to break down here with my legal panelists. I'll introduce them after the break. You're watching Law and Crime.
Murdaugh will now stand trial on financial integrity charges in Murdaugh, South Carolina.
I was as nice as I could be.
Welcome back to On Crime. We're waiting to jump live into the Walterboro, South Carolina courtroom where the sentencing hearing will begin shortly for Alec Murdaugh. The disgraced former attorney was found guilty after under just 3 hours of jury deliberations. Now, Murdaugh faces up to life in prison without the possibility of parole. We will take you live as soon as the hearing starts, but for now, I want to go back to some of the testimony from Murdaugh himself. This is his cross-examination where he is asked about the dog kennel lie, which is a key piece of evidence that could have led to his conviction. Let's listen in.
So you're telling me I never responded to Jim Griffin? Is that what you're saying here today?
I'm telling you.
Are you saying that you ever before yesterday reached out to anyone through yourself or through your attorneys and reached out to anyone in law enforcement or the prosecution and told them the story about the kennels? Are you telling me that?
What I'm telling you,
answer my
Mr.
question
Waters,
first, please, sir. Answer my question first. Did you ever reach out to anyone in law enforcement or the prosecution and tell that story that you told this jury yesterday about the kennels before yesterday?
Did I ever reach out to law enforcement to say, I want to tell you about the kennels? No, sir, I did not.
This is the Fifth Amendment line.
Pardon?
This questioning about him volunteering information on these charges violates his Fifth Amendment rights, and we strongly object. Any more, we have to make a motion.
He brought it up.
The objection's overruled.
What I did was,
Answer my question first, sir.
You know, for the record, he did not bring it. He was talking about the financial
Sit down,
stuff.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes or no question. Before yesterday, did you ever bring up what you told this jury about that kennels to anybody in the prosecution or anybody in law enforcement?
no, I didn't have the opportunity to, Mr. Waters, because you would not respond to my invitations to reach out and tell you about all the things that I'd done wrong. And to talk about bringing this to a head, to talk about bringing this to closure. I understand how many people I hurt. I understand how angry my partners are and how hurt they are. And I understand how hurt these people that I stole money from are. I understand how hurt they are. And one of the things that I believe is getting past this may help them get some closure. And so since at least January, I've been trying to sit down with y'all, to talk to y'all.
Okay.
And never, ever got a response to the multiple requests.
Multiple requests?
Yes, sir, multiple requests.
All right, I have a couple of legal panelists who are anxious to talk about all of this. I'm joined this morning by litigator Richard Schoenstein, along with criminal defense attorney Kesia Early. Thank you both for coming on. I'll start with you, Kesia. This morning, a juror spoke out about deliberations and said that the kennel video is what pushed them over the edge of thinking he was guilty. Do you think deliberations would have been longer, or even the verdict would have been different without it?
It absolutely would have. And the kennel video did it for me as well, because it was eerie to hear his voice in the background. And then for him to deny that not only was that his voice, but that he was there. It's as if Paul kind of spoke from the grave, because what are the odds of Paul recording this interaction with Bubba and his voice in the background at that moment? So not only did he just give a plain lie, he lied about the critical moment That was his opportunity to not only tell the truth, but also to eliminate him as a suspect to find the true killers. So the fact that he had to come clean, he only came clean because his back was up against the wall. And that is what did it for me. And I held on to him being guilty from that moment on.
And Rich, did Murdaugh have any other choice besides admitting to being at the kennels that night once he took the stand? I mean, do you think it would have been better to just stick with his story and deny that it was his voice altogether?
Well, first of all, I don't think there was any possible way he could deny it was his voice. Witness after witness had said 100% that's him. You could tell it was him. But I'm glad we started with the examination of Alec Murdaugh, because for me, that's the centerpiece of this case. You can talk about GPS and all the data. You can talk about SLED's investigation. You can talk about one shooter, two shooters. You can talk about all that stuff. But the defendant took the stand from a day and a half. He sat 6 feet, 10 feet away from those jurors. He looked them in the eye and he said he didn't do it. And they did not believe him. And that, first and foremost, is why we have a jury, to determine credibility of the witnesses. And when a defendant dripping in lies like Alec Murdaugh was, admittedly lying over the years to so many people in so many circumstances and lying about the investigation, for him to get on the stand was a daring move, but I think it backfired. That jury did not believe him, and they found him guilty because of it.
Well, like I said, they didn't believe any tears. They just said they saw snot. That was the only thing.
Yes, he was trying for a snot guilty verdict, but he didn't get it.
There you go. All right. Well, another pivotal piece of Murdaugh's testimony was when Prosecutor Creighton Waters asked him what he believed happened to his wife and son. And he played some of the defendant's police video to demonstrate. Let's take a listen to that.
Most of this was stuff from between a couple of them, but not.
You had talked about yesterday in great detail about the boat case, which you brought up on the 911 call and to Daniel Green, and then of course in this first interview, correct?
I did mention the boat wreck.
All right, and you described that. Do you remember what you said in this interview about the boat wreck?
Not specifically.
About specifically the other people involved in the boat wreck? You don't remember specifically? Do you remember specifically? I guess you said no.
I remember talking about the boat wreck, and I know that I talked about the boat wreck.
All right. Well, I'm going to play now from 1714.
Any direct threats between any of the people on the boat specifically, but I do think there's been a small amount of yip-yap between a couple of them, but not recently.
What was the term you used for that? A small amount of yip-yap?
Yeah, and just to be clear, Mr. Waters, there was never, ever a point in time where I thought that the people that were involved in the boat wreck did this to Paw and Maggie. Okay. I've never thought that.
All right. I never thought that, but it's literally one of the first things that you said out of the 911 call.
Nah, that's not what I said. I never, ever, ever under any point in time believed that those kids that were riding in that boat or their parents or their families, I didn't believe that any of the families, the people that were involved in the boat wreck had anything to do with hurting Maggie and Paul. Okay. But I can tell you that at that time, and as I sit here today, that I believe that boat wreck is the reason why Paw and Maggie were killed.
Okay.
And I'm certain, I believe that.
It was random vigilantes, the 5-2 vigilantes, huh?
No, what I believe, Mr. Waters, is I believe that when Paul was charged criminally, there were so many leaks, half-truths, half reports, half statements, partial information, misrepresentations of Paul that ended up in the media all the time. And when I tell you the social media response that came from that was vile, the things that were said about what they would do to Paul, they were so over the top that nobody would believe anybody would get on social media and do that. But I believe then, and I believe today, that the wrong person saw and read that.
Okay.
Because I can tell you for a fact that the person or people who did what I saw on June the 7th, they hated Paul Murdaugh and they had anger in their heart. And that is the only reason that somebody could be mad at Paul like that and hate him like that.
All right, so we've got random vigilantes because of the boat wreck.
Now, I don't know that they're random vigilantes.
Well, you just said it wasn't the family or the kid or the kids or the family of the other kids in the boat, right? So you're saying it's somebody off of social media, and you don't have any evidence of that, do you? You just believe that. You're just telling that jury that as you try to explain the lie that you told for the first time yesterday. Isn't that right?
No, sir, that's not right.
It's not right. All right. Well, let me ask you a question then. So what you're telling this jury is that it's a random vigilante.
That's your
the 12-year-old, the 12-year-old 5'2" people that just happened to know that Paul and Maggie were both at Moselle on June 7th, that knew that they would be at the kennels alone on June the 7th, that knew that you would not be there, but only between the times of 8:49 and 9:02, that they show up without a weapon, assuming that they're going to find weapons and ammunition there, that they commit this crime during that short time window, and then they travel the same exact route that you do around the same time to Alameda. That's what you're trying to tell this jury?
You got a lot of factors in there, Mr. Waters, all of which I do not agree with, but some of which I do.
Well, it's interesting because the jury knew he lied and felt that his lies were just not good enough. And Murdaugh always seemed to blame someone else. Rich, what do you make of all the different stories and reasons the defendant gave? Would have it helped him to stick to just one story?
I think the stories are a big part of why the jury got where it is. Why the jury, by human nature, wants to figure out, well, if he didn't do this, who else did? And the idea of social media vigilantes storming the property, finding Paul at the kennel, killing his mom too. Why did they kill the mom if they were just mad at Paul? Why didn't they kill Alec? How was Alec on the property but didn't encounter these social media 5'2" assassins? None of it made sense. You have to throw it all out. And that clip we just watched, I think we have not given Creighton Waters enough credit for the cross-examination he did. It was a little too long. He spent a little too much time on the financial stuff, but he nailed Murdaugh on that question and answer about that theory not making any sense. And he nailed Murdaugh at the end about the kennel video lie. He had a lot of good moments in that cross-examination, and I think that resonated with the jury.
Well, at the end of the day, he got the job done. Casey, what do you think?
Well, just hearing his testimony, it's like the pot calling the kettle black. He had the nerve to point to half truths. And then what really struck me is the fact that he had a reason why both Maggie and Paul were murdered. I mean, I always try to think, as a criminal defense attorney, I try to think as a juror as well. And if you have a reason, that's kind of eerie because that reason was your reason because you were the murderer. And it just goes back to the essential, money is the root of all evil. His love for money was the motivating force as to why he committed this, because he gave a reason, but that was definitely his reason.
All right, well, I'm keeping an eye on the courtroom feed and we will go live to the sentencing hearing as soon as we can. But for now, we are going to take another quick break here on Law and Crime. Don't go anywhere. So much more from South Carolina next. Thanks for joining us on Law and Crime. The sentencing hearing for convicted murderer Alec Murdaugh is expected to happen very soon down in South Carolina. The disgraced former attorney was found guilty last night in the shooting deaths of his wife Maggie and son Paul. We expect to hear victim impact statements before Judge Newman hands down that sentence, which could be up to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While we wait to jump live, let's take a look back at some of the closing arguments, starting with the states. This is Prosecutor Creighton Waters.
No one knew who he was. No one knew who this man was. He'd avoided accountability his whole life. He had relied on his family name. He had a powerful family. He carried a badge and used that authority. He lived a wealthy life. But now finally, he was facing complete ruin. His father, who he idolized, who I worked with on occasion, was dying. His son was facing charges for the boat case. He was facing a civil action that not only could potentially ruin him, but expose the reality of what he'd been doing for years. He had an opiate addiction. The entire illusion of his life was about to be altered. He couldn't live for that. He's the kind of person for which shame is an extraordinary provocation. Shame is an extraordinary provocation. His ego couldn't stand that, and he became a family annihilator. And I was thinking, that people who get the last word in this courtroom are y'all. And a lot of witnesses have testified over the last 6 weeks, but there's a couple that never get to testify but are important, and that's common sense and human nature. And there's 2 more that don't get to testify. We couldn't bring you any eyewitnesses because they were murdered. But common sense and human nature can speak on behalf of Maggie and Paul. When you look at this in its totality, common sense and human nature can speak for them. And they deserve a voice. Everything he did was meant to try to frustrate the forensics as a lawyer and a prosecutor with the 2 guns and the manufactured alibi, and not taking his phone down to the scene, deleting call logs, making short phone calls, bringing up the boat case, moving Maggie's phone, changing clothes, looking at Paul's phone, calling Rogan, or trying to call Rogan. One man controlled this crime scene initially, and that was Alec. But there were some things he couldn't control. And we brought those to you.
And throughout these closings, basically what Creighton Waters was trying to point out was that he had no problem lying to those close to him. And everything he did was for one person, the person he loved most and wanted to protect. And that was himself. Would you agree, Rich Schoenstein?
Oh, I totally agree. That was definitely the theme of the prosecution. I just want to take a second. I want to commend all of the lawyers in this case. That closing was great. The defense closings were great. The 4 prominent lawyers in this case were tremendous. They communicated to the jury. They struck a good balance between the data in the case and the emotion of the case. And they used both effectively. You know, only one side can win, but this was an outstanding work by some very good trial lawyers.
Well, as you just heard, Creighton Waters using the connection of common sense and nature. Kesia, did that resonate with this jury?
Absolutely, because every juror wants to feel empowered, and he gave them that. And I was comparing the closing arguments with the defense and the prosecution. Now, the first half of the prosecution closing arguments moved rather slowly, but it was the rebuttal that got me, because I'm looking at the defense attorney and he's reading from a script. He wasn't given that eye-to-eye connection. Even if you would resonate with just one juror, hoping to get that hung jury, because for me, there was no way that I saw this would be a not guilty verdict. I was thinking either hung jury or, guilty verdict. But the closing argument for the defense, as he was reading, it just felt to me that he didn't believe in his case, and he was just trying the case and doing what he had to do. But that rebuttal by the prosecution, it spoke to the heart of the case. And he drove home the point that power and privilege will not prevail. And if all of these people who knew Alec Murdaugh all their lives and worked with this man day in and day out didn't know who he was, how are you, the jury, who only had the opportunity to view him and listen to his testimony for a day and a half, look beyond his lies? He lied to the people he loved most, and he's lying to you. Don't let him get away with it. And that message is what drove home the point. And I believe that was the swaying decision for the guilty verdict.
Very well said there, Kesia. And now let's go to the defense closing argument, as you mentioned, when Jim Griffin speaks to all the questions about the night of the murders that haven't been answered yet.
In this case, on June 7th, 2021, Alec Murdaugh called 911, and Deputy Green, and then followed by other deputies, rolled up on the scene. And he is standing on his property. His wife and son lie dead in a pool of blood each. He's within yards of him, and he just put a shotgun down. He just put a shotgun down. And what would that look like? 90 out of 100 cases when the officer rolls up, it would look like the person who had the shotgun and two dead bodies may have done it, probably have done it. Certainly is someone who should be strongly considered. And all the officers in this case told you that. Deputy Rutland said, yeah, Alec Murdaugh was a suspect, but there are a lot of suspects out there. Everybody was a suspect. Fair enough.
Be seated.
Is ready to proceed?
State's ready, Your Honor.
All right, from the state, Mr. Waters.
Thank you, Your Honor. We're obviously here in the sentencing for the state versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh. Your Honor, I have prepared the sentencing sheets signed up. If I can hand those up to the clerk. Your Honor, very quickly, the defendant has no prior record, and the state has no victim impact people who want to speak at this time. But I will address the court briefly. And I don't need, Your Honor, to repeat the evidence that Your Honor just heard for the past 6 weeks, but it is overwhelming. And it shows this man to be a cunning manipulator, a man who placed himself above all others, including his family. A man who violated the trust of so many, including his friends, his family, his partners, his profession, but most of all, Maggie and Paul. This is a very complicated situation, and I want to offer my condolences to the family that has suffered here. We have tried very hard to be respectful and sensitive regardless of what position any person took. because this family has suffered and they've had to suffer in the public eye. And I want to offer my condolences to this family. I want to offer it for Maggie and Paul and Mr. Randolph too, who I had the pleasure of working with on one occasion. But the reality remains is that despite all this attention, this case is about Maggie Murdaugh and Paul Murdaugh, and I'm so thankful that the jurors gave them a voice. You heard about Paul. Obviously, there was the boat case, but you also heard him described as a fun-loving young man, a person who loved life, a person who would do anything for his friends, for anyone. And he's cut down as he was just starting to live his life. You heard about Maggie. You heard how sweet she was. You heard that she was a girl's girl who adapted to the outdoorsman life of her sons, how much she loved her sister and her brother-in-law and their children. And she was cut down in the prime of her life. Both of them, like everyone else, was unaware of who he really was. No one who thought they knew this man, no one who thought they were close to this man knew who he really was. And Your Honor, that's chilling. And I've looked in his eyes, and he liked to stare me down as he would walk by me during this trial. And I could see the real Alex Murdaugh when he looked at me. The depravity, the callousness, the selfishness of these crimes are stunning. The lack of remorse and the effortless way in which he lies, including here, sitting right over there in this witness stand. Your Honor, a man like that, a man like this man, should never be allowed to be among free, law-abiding citizens again. And I would submit to you that the only just sentence here to give justice for Maggie and Paul is the maximum, and that would be 2 consecutive life sentences. Thank you, Your Honor.
You indicate that no victim would like to speak at this time. Would any victim like to speak at any time during these proceedings?
Your Honor, one of the things we did early on, obviously, as I just said, it's a very complicated situation, but we made the decision early on. We've had our victim advocate here who's been doing a wonderful job, regardless of the viewpoints of any individual family member, to provide aid and service to them, and we made that decision. I'm informed by our victim advocate that none of them wish to speak. The defense can certainly address that, but that's what I'm informed. But they certainly were offered the opportunity as is required, and I want to commend our victim advocate on the excellent job she did in handling this complex situation that we wanted to be sensitive to, because again, none of us are not mindful of the fact of the suffering of this family.
I know Chief Mark Keel is here. Would you like to address the court on any matters, Chief?
Yes, sir. Just to say again, very proud of our agents, the work they've done. I'm proud of the partnership that we've had with the Attorney General's office as we've had for many years. And again, we're here to see the justice is served, and we believe it has been.
Thank you. For the defense.
Your Honor, Mr. Griffin, I would have no comment. The defendant would like to address the court, though.
Mr. Murdaugh.
Good morning, Your Honor. I'm innocent. I would never hurt my wife, Maggie, and I would never hurt my son, Paw.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anything further?
I don't think further comment is necessary, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Murdaugh, if you'll come before the court for sentencing. This has been perhaps one of the most troubling cases, not just for me as a judge, for the state, for the defense team, but for all of the citizens in this community, all the citizens in this state, and as we've seen based on the media coverage there throughout the nation, you have a wife who's been killed, murdered, a son savagely murdered, a lawyer, a person from a respected family who has controlled justice in this community for over a century, a person whose grandfather's portrait hanging at the back of the courthouse that I had to have ordered removed in order to ensure that a fair trial was had by both the state and the defense. And I sat through the trial. Not only have I sat through the trial, but also as the presiding judge of the state grand jury, sat through and participated in the issuance of search warrants of various sorts, bond hearings, and have had to consider many things. And we have this case, and I'm also assigned to preside over, is it 9 others? At least 9 other cases. Though testimony has come up regarding many of those other cases, I will not make any comment with regard to any other pending matter, as I have been assigned those cases as well. It's also particularly troubling, Mr. Murdaugh, because as a member of the legal community and a well-known member of the legal community, you've practiced law before me, and we've seen each other at various occasions throughout the years. And it was especially heartbreaking for me to see you go in the media from being a grieving father who lost a wife and a son to being the person indicted and convicted of killing them. And you've engaged in such duplicitous conduct here in the courtroom, here on the witness stand, and as established by the testimony throughout the time, from the time of the indictment and prior to the indictment throughout the trial to this moment in time. Certainly, you have no obligation to say anything other than saying not guilty. And obviously, as appeals are probably expected or absolutely expected, I would not expect a confession of any kind. In fact, as I've presided over murder cases over the past 22 years, I have yet to find a defendant who could go there, who could go back to that moment in time when they decided to pull the trigger or to otherwise murder someone. I have not been able to get anyone, any defendant, even those who have confessed to being guilty, to go back and explain to me what happened at that moment in time when they opted to pull the trigger, when they opted to commit the most heinous crimes known to man. In this case, qualifies under the death penalty statute based on the statutory aggravating circumstances of two or more people being murdered by the defendant by one act or pursuant to one scheme or course of conduct. I don't question at all the decision of the state not to pursue the death penalty. But as I sit here in this courtroom and look around the many portraits of judges and other court officials and reflect on the fact that over the past century, your family, including you, have been prosecuting people here in this courtroom, and many have received the death penalty, probably for lesser conduct. Remind me of the expression you gave on the witness stand. Was it tangled?
Tangled web, we weave.
Oh, what tangled web we weave. What did you mean by that?
Meant when I lied, I continue to lie.
And the question is, when will it end? When will it end? And it's for the jury because they've concluded that you continue to lie and lied throughout your testimony. And perhaps with all the throng of people here, they, for the most part, all believe, or 80, 90%, 99% believe that you continue to lie now when your statement of denial to the court. Perhaps you believe that it does not matter, that there's nothing that can mitigate a sentence given the crimes that were committed. You know, a notice of alibi was filed in this case by counsel in November, and we conducted a hearing, pretrial hearing, in which you claim to have been someplace else at the time the crime was committed. Then, after all the witnesses placed you at the scene of the crime, at the last minute, or last minutes or days, you switch courses and admitted to being there. And then that necessitated more lies and continued to lie. And I said, it's already ended for many who have heard you and concluded that it'll never end. But within your own soul, you have to deal with that. And I know you have to see Paul and Maggie during the night times when you're attempting to go to sleep. I'm sure they come and visit you. I'm sure.
All day and every night.
Yeah, I'm sure. And they will continue to do so. And reflect on the last time they looked you in the eyes, as you looked the jury in the eyes. I don't know a person who's always been such a gregarious, friendly person and cause their life to be tangled in such a web such a situation that yours have spun into. And it's so unfortunate because you had such a lovely family of such friendly people, and including you, and to go from that to this. Your license to practice law has been stripped away from you. You turned from lawyer to witness, and now have an opportunity to make your final appeal as an ex-lawyer. And it's it's really surprising that you're waiving this right at this time. And if you have to do so, it's on you. You're not compelled to say anything, but you have the opportunity to do so.
Judge, I tell you again, I respect this court, but I'm innocent. I would never, under any circumstances, hurt my wife, Maggie, and I would never, under any circumstances, hurt my son, Paw.
Well, it might have been you. It might have been the monster you become when you take 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 opioid pills. Maybe you become another person. I've seen that before. The person standing before me was not the person who committed the crime. It's the same individual. We'll leave that at that. Before announcing sentence on these cases, with regard to all of the other pending cases, are any of them here in Culloden, or I'm sure some of them are?
Yes, sir.
Half of them, or?
I don't have that in front of me, but there are a substantial number of charges here. There's some in Hampton, Orangeburg, Beaufort, Allendale. There may be others I'm not thinking of right now.
We might want our welcome here in Culloden. They have been, and I'll take this opportunity to thank Sheriff Hill and all of the court officials and really everyone I've met and dealt with while here in Culloden County. Just been great. But without any delay, we're going to schedule some of the other matters. I know Mr. Harpootlian's scheduling is complicated, and you've sacrificed quite a bit to be able to be here defending Mr. Murdaugh, as well as the Attorney General's office, with all the other many things and obligations you have. And to be able to have the Attorney General here, Alan Wilson, for the period of time that he's devoted to being here, along with everyone else, it's been quite a sacrifice. But the victims whose cases deserve to be heard, and this case has jumped some of those other cases. Perhaps jumped it because of this case resulting in an assault on the integrity of the judicial system in our state, law enforcement in our state. Even during this trial, the law enforcement have been maligned for the past 5 or 6 weeks by one who had access to the wheels of justice, to be able to deflect the investigation And as the evidence is pointed out in this case, the looming storm that Mr. Waters talked about, I can just imagine on that day, June 7th, when a lawyer is confronted and confesses to having stolen over $500,000 from a client, and he has a tiger like Mark Tinsley on his tail pursuing discovery in the case involving the death of Mallory Beach, and having a father, for the most part, on his deathbed. I could imagine, I really can't imagine, but I know it had to have been quite a bit going through your mind on that day. But amazingly, to have you come and testify that it was just another ordinary day, that my wife and son and I were out just enjoying life. Not credible, not believable. You can convince yourself about it, but obviously you have the inability to convince anyone else about that. So if you made any such arguments as a lawyer, you would lose every case of that, like that. Cases you will never have an opportunity to argue anymore, except perhaps your own as you sit in the Department of Corrections. Anything further?
No, sir.
All right, Mr. Murdaugh, I sentence you to the State Department of Corrections on each of the murder indictments in the murder of your wife, Maggie Murdaugh. I sentence you for the term of the rest of your natural life for the murder of Paul Murdaugh, whom you probably love so much. I sentence you to prison for murdering him for the rest of your natural life. Those sentences will run consecutive. Under the statute involving possession of a weapon during a violent crime, there is no sentence where a life sentence is imposed on other indictments. That is the sense of the court, and you are remanded to the State Department of Corrections. And officers may carry forth on the imposition. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Before we adjourn, was issued concerning maintaining the juror's identity being anonymous. That order was issued, and for the most part, it's been complied with, except for the jury leaving the courtroom yesterday, or not the jury, but the defendant leaving the courtroom while the jury is still seated. Protecting the identity of the jurors is certainly extremely important during the course of a trial to ensure that no one makes contact with the jury or attempts to influence the jury. Jurors have a right to continue that privacy beyond their jury service, but they're not obligated to do so. And it would not surprise me if jurors choose to come forward and to speak, and they're encouraged to do so if that is their desire. I have no problem whatsoever with the jurors unmasking themselves and speaking freely with the media, because they have undergone a life-changing experience, and as it relates to many of them. And some of them are here now, and I want them to know that should anyone attempt to harass them or annoy them, please let me know and I will address the issue. Secondly, there's a complaint now regarding the posting of autopsy photographs or photos that came from within the courtroom. It's based on the direction of the photographs. It did not come from the audience. It came somehow from within the well of the court. The parties have requested an investigation of that. I have my hands full doing my job, and I don't attempt to conduct any investigations beyond the conducting of a trial. But to the extent that law enforcement decides to review that, will be a responsibility of law enforcement. Yes. And of course, one of the reasons we've sought to sample graphic photos is because the parties have a right to privacy and a right to those matters not being publicly disclosed. If anyone has heard about the recent settlement that Kobe Bryant's, another sports analogy, Kobe Bryant's wife just made with Los Angeles County and others out there over certain disclosures of information involving the death of Kobe Bryant. Liability can be substantial, and it's a risk for the most part that's not worth taking. So we'll let everyone judge themselves accordingly with that regard. Aside from other businesses done here in Colleton County, and I get to use my gavel one or few times during this trial and order that the court be adjourned. Sunny day. All right. sentence you to the State Department of Corrections on each of the murder indictments in the murder of your wife, Maggie Murdaugh. I sentence you for a term of the rest of your natural life.
And that just happened moments ago. Convicted murderer and former attorney Alec Murdaugh was sentenced to life in prison this morning. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Yu. Thanks for joining us. This came after the guilty verdict was reached last night by a Walterboro jury who are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Murdaugh killed his wife, Maggie, and son, Paul, back on June 7th of 2021. Before I bring my legal panel to chat about all of this, let's hear some of what Judge Newman had to say to Alec Murdaugh himself this morning before handing down his sentence.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.